when I heard about this, I thought to myself, how is it possible that a horse you might have spent, maybe a couple $100,000 for, maybe even more, a horse that wins the Kentucky Derby, how does this horse end up in the food chain?
Hello everyone, and welcome back to Reinforce the Horse. Today we are here with Victor Bahna, and being raised just a few miles from Long Island's Belmont Park racetrack, Victor fell in love with horse racing during his high school years. Upon winning a few dollars his first day at the races, he was instantly hooked on the excitement, adrenaline, and beauty of the sport. A few decades later, he ventured into the realm of thoroughbred ownership and purchased his first racehorse at Emerald Downs. Today, he owns a pair of broodmares and manages a small racing partnership under the stable name of Royal Victory Thoroughbreds. He is a devoted advocate for racehorses, for racehorse welfare and longevity. His debut novel, Heliacal Star, draws on this passion and experience. Victor, thank you so much for joining me today. Welcome to the Reinforce the Horse podcast. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on your podcast.
Of course, it's lovely to have you, and there's a lot to talk about today. I mean, it sounds like you have quite a story to tell with being a new author of your book and being in the racehorse industry for, it sounds like, quite some time. Can you walk us through a little bit about how your horsemanship journey began?
Yeah, I'd be happy to do that. It began, as you mentioned in the bio, back on Long Island where I grew up, and my interest in racing began with those trips to the racetrack when we were back in my days of high school. And this was pre-internet, so it seems like it's a long time ago. But what we would do is we would find our way on a local bus that would take us from one of my friend's houses to the racetrack, and we would catch the last few races of the day. And it was really just through those interactions a couple days a week that it became a pretty exciting hobby, I guess, at that time. And it just kind of grew from there. I mean, just the sport itself is super exciting, but the work you put into handicapping a race and trying to figure out who's going to win and looking at past performances, it could be a bit intimidating at first looking at a racing form. But as you start to learn about the different components of a race and how to read a racing form, it actually becomes, it takes it to a whole new level. And that's what we encountered, I guess, as we first, as me and my friends started going to the racetrack and watching these races. And we were pretty lucky, I think, as first timers, perhaps, or second or third timers. We hit a few races. We won a few dollars, and that's pretty much all it took to kind of get us hooked on adrenaline and the excitement of doing it.
During your first experiences with being at the track, did you have any one-to-one experiences with the horses or the racers that were, racing these horses?
Not so much at the racetrack. I did take a college course a few years later when I was on Eastern Long Island, and I did get a chance to learn much more about horses. It was a horsemanship class in which we got to work directly with horses. We got to do grooming. We did classroom work, and then we also did some riding, and we did some very low-level jumping as well, even. And that was over the course of a semester or two. And that was pretty fun too, because some of them were quarter horses, some of them were former racehorses, and so that was pretty exciting for me to get on the back of a former racehorse and get to experience that, and then just a little bit of riding here and there, but not much else after that until I moved out to the West Coast, where I am now, and there was probably a gap of it had to be at least 20, 25 years between times I put a saddle on a horse and got on one. And it was kind of an interesting experience getting back on a horse after all that time. But it wasn't too hard to just sort of pick up where I left off, even though there was a pretty large gap in time.
So with I mean, you mentioned a pretty large gap in time with, getting back on a horse. Was the horse that you got on later, was this your horse, or was this a someone else's?
Not yet.
Okay.
I do that now. I have my own horse that I get on, who's a retired thoroughbred. But at that time, it was just one of the farm horses that they use for lessons, and
cool.
did that for maybe about 2 years or so, and then my horse was retired. He had raced until he was aged 8, and he had been turned out for about a year on the farm. And I thought to myself, let's bring him in and let's see if I can learn to ride this guy. And it was pretty intimidating at first because he's about 16 hands, and he's got a lot of personality, and kind of likes to run the show a little bit himself. And so that was a good experience for me. He's been a good teacher, really helped me a lot in terms of just grooming and working with him and building a relationship and riding occasionally as well. So all of that has been over the last, I think he's been with me now for about 8-9 years now. So we've been at it now for a while, and
Wow.
he still has a really big personality. He sometimes
really
thinks he's a
cool.
3-year-old, but that's just him.
Oh man, he seems like such a sweet guy.
He is.
Do you think he enjoyed his racing career? Like, do you get that feeling from him?
I definitely get that feeling from him. He would probably race again if he had the opportunity.
Oh, wow. Do you know why he was retired?
Yeah, he was retired because he was age 8, and he had a little bit of had some suspensory issues. I think they weren't major. I mean, he wasn't. He didn't require any surgery or anything like that after racing, but he was someone that just was time to just hang up the racing part of his life and move on. And he was a fun racehorse when he was racing, and he's a fun racehorse as he's retired now.
Man, well, that's really cool. You mentioned that he's taught you a lot of lessons about, just being around him. What are some of the best, or I guess most meaningful lessons that he's taught you in the years that you've had him?
Sure. I would say when you first get on, well, for me, when I first got on the thoroughbred and knowing what kind of power and energy and strength that he might have, my first inclination was to be nervous and to kind of grip him a little bit with my legs. And I guess the first lesson is just learn how to relax. And, even though you might feel a bit tense yourself, knowing that if you're going to be tense, he's going to be tense because he's going to feel that, and he'll respond to that tension. But if you can just relax yourself, then he'll learn to feed off of that too. So that was an important lesson, and it took a while because it's a bit counterintuitive. Again, you're getting up there and you're not wanting to fall off, and so what you do when you don't want to fall off something is you grab it tighter, and that's kind of the opposite of what you want to be doing, especially with a 16-hand thoroughbred. The second thing I would say is, I mentioned he's pretty willful, and getting into a direct confrontation with him is not a productive session for him or for me, and it's not pleasurable for either of us. And you could, again, being somewhat of a newbie when I started with him, your instinct is to try to just, I wouldn't say, you're just trying to force your will on him, not in a dangerous or harmful way, but getting frustrated with the fact that he might not be listening to what you're asking him to do. And so another lesson I learned is don't escalate, but learn to de-escalate, and learn to listen to the cues and the signals that you're getting from them, or from him in my case. And, over the 8-9 years, it's become pretty easy for him to communicate with me and me to communicate with him. If I compare how difficult it was just to even get him. Like I'd put him in the tie-up rack and try to clean his feet, and he'd be moving around. He'd be trying to get out of the tie-up. He'd be biting the saddle rack and throwing it on the ground. And oh yeah, he's definitely got that kind of character and personality. And he would not stand still, or he'd move his legs, or there was a few times he tried to sit on me when I picked up his back leg.
Oh no. Oh man, he definitely is going to tell you that when you need something.
Oh yes.
Wow.
So I learned that, okay, I need to find another way. I'm not going to be able to just, force him into doing things that he's not going to want to do. So some of it is letting it be his idea. Some of it is just kind of reading his body language and his energy level. Now I know if his energy's, if I'm bringing him in from pasture and his energy's pretty high, it's pretty easy for me to detect that. The one thing he's really good at is kind of telegraphing his mood.
Oh wow!
So if he's gonna blow, I know he's gonna blow, and if he's not feeling that, then I know he's okay to go. And so, it's been a good experience for me just to kind of learn all those different, sort of personalities or types of emotions that he can share. And so really I think that's probably the third thing, is just learning to communicate non-verbally. Now if I lunge him, I don't need a lunge line to lunge him.
Oh.
I don't need to say anything even. He could just move off of my movements. So if I speed up, he speeds up. If I slow down, he slows down. And that's really nice, actually. And then,
that seems like such a beautiful connection.
Yeah. And then when we slow down, he'll slow down. And if I actually motion him to come over to me after we're done lunging, he'll come over to me. And, he'll know that, okay, we're done with this. And, it's now we'll play follow the leader for a little while.
I love that. Man, I can feel the connection through just how you're talking about him and his response and reaction to you, and the way that you can connect and listen to him. I'm curious, what drew you to this horse in particular? And
yeah. Sorry,
was it like when you met him, was it just him that you were meeting, or were there multiple horses that you got to meet before choosing him?
Yeah, so he was a horse that I owned as a racehorse as well. And so I actually purchased him as a yearling when he was at the Keeneland sale back in 2007, I think. So it was a while ago when I purchased him as a yearling.
Oh, wow.
And then he raced for me for a couple years. He actually he got claimed off of me in a race in Hollywood Park at one point, and then I ended up claiming him back. And claiming, I'm not sure if you're familiar with that.
I'm not familiar with it.
Claiming is basically a term for racing, and most of the races in North America are what we call claiming races, which means that every horse is effectively on sale ahead of the race for a set claiming price. And if you were to drop a claim for a horse ahead of the race, you would have to do it a certain amount of time ahead of the race. You would have to ensure you've got the funds in your account with the racetrack. You need to make sure you have a named trainer. So you have a bunch of prerequisites that you go through.
Okay.
And then if you drop that claim, then the horse after the race moves to the new owner and to the new barn. And so that happened with him. And you do that because that's where you basically can compete. You'd say, well, why would you do that? Why would you put a horse in a race that you could lose them to a claim? Most of the racing in the U.S. Is going to be in the claiming ranks, because to get to avoid that, I should say, you need to have a very elite racehorse. And the elite racehorses are the ones you see in the Kentucky Derby or the other stakes races, and those will never be in a claiming race. But when you start kind of getting notches below that, there are different levels, and a horse can be in a claiming race, as low as $2,500 to up to over $100,000. So there's a huge range, and you try to fit the horse where you think they can be most competitive. in his case, he was kind of on that borderline of top end of the claiming ranks, and sort of the low end of the stakes race. So I did put him in a pretty high priced claiming race where someone actually claimed him.
Okay.
And then he was actually off for a year from racing, and they brought him back in a slightly lower level claiming race, and so I used the money that they gave me to buy him, and I bought him back with the same money. So,
oh, wow.
And then after that, he raced a few more times, and then we retired him. So, that's my story with him. My connection with him really didn't start until after he was retired, though. I mean, I knew he was a big personality from watching him on the racetrack and in the barn area, and just talking to some of the grooms and some of the exercise riders, and he always seemed to be the one they remembered in terms of when they were on the racetrack, and he was one that definitely drew a lot of attention from pretty much everybody. So
how so? Was it his energy, or just like his go, the win?
Yeah, his energy. Sometimes the horses will not necessarily be as people friendly.
Okay.
There's a mix. I mean, some of them are, some of them aren't. Just like people are. But he basically would have his head sticking out of the stall perpetually, and he was always looking for someone to feed him a carrot or give him a little scratch. And then the riders basically would say, he just was full of energy, full of life. He just seemed like he was having such a good time when he was out on the racetrack. So they all remembered him quite a bit too.
That's beautiful. So you mentioned that you owned him at a young age, but so did you actually get to race on him? Like, were you his riders he was racing?
No, definitely
Okay.
not. Number one, I'm way too heavy to be a rider on the racetrack,
Okay.
and number two, I'm way not skilled enough to do that. So
Interesting. So I'm not quite familiar with that, because I initially, when you said that you owned him at a young age, like I jumped to, my brain was like, oh, you must have raced on him. I wasn't. So how does it work? Like, if you own a horse that is not, I guess that you're not directly racing. Like, does that mean that he goes home with you after the race and you care for him, or like how does that work?
Yeah, so the racehorses will mostly stay at the racetrack.
Okay.
So they'll work with the trainer, and the trainers will have anywhere from 1 to 40, 50 horses, depending on how many stalls and how many horses and how many owners they have.
Wow.
And so that's effectively the manager that runs the day-to-day operations. So they take care of the horse from checking them out every morning in terms of are they sound, are there any issues. They take their temperatures, they check their legs, they walk them around. They manage all of the training programs. They'll be really hands-on with regard to the day-to-day prep work that goes into preparing them for ultimately for a race. And then they'll decide on who the rider is. So there's a jockey colony at the racetrack as well, and certain riders may fit certain horses. It really just depends, but the trainer has a good sense of who the riders are, and they'll tend to work with a couple of riders that they'll rotate through, and they'll think about who might be the best rider for that particular horse. Does it need someone that's really light with the touch? Does it need someone that needs to kind of ride a little bit harder on the horse, or someone that needs to be a little bit stronger on the horse? They'll kind of figure that out, just based upon some of the feedback they get from the riders that are exercising them in the morning.
Okay.
And their own observations too, and then their knowledge of the riding community. And so
Wow.
that's kind of what they'll do. And then when they're not racing, they'll turn out to a farm typically. So let's say they're not in training, and or they need a break from training. They'll typically turn out for, it could be just a quick 30 days, just to give them a refreshener, or they could be off for 6 months to give them a little bit more time, or if they're coming back from a nagging injury or something that is requiring, more time. We've had horses that have been off for more than a year or two. So it really depends upon, where the horse is at, how old they are, how many times they've raced. But they do get that turnout time. And most of that turnout time is just out in pasture. They just are allowed to kind of do their own thing with their buddies out in pasture. And then when it's time to start training again, then they come back in and they kind of go back through the routine at the racetrack.
Man, that's really cool. It sounds like, and I say this, and I'm one with very little knowledge about the whole racing industry, and it's one reason why I'm actually quite excited that you're here talking with me, because there's a good amount of questions I have about, like, I guess I'll start this with what I'm hearing is that it can be such a beautiful and exciting space for both, or all involved, for the riders of the horse, the horses, the people who are watching and trying to claim these horses. And like, it sounds like, and the horses seem like they're taken care of well. They get to go out to pasture and they get a break off of racing. They have a trainer who's taking care of them and checking them and, ensuring that everything goes right while they're on the racetrack. But there's also the controversy where I've heard things, or short videos will come up on YouTube or whatever, where it seems like it's not, like, it seems like the racing industry is, they have their flaws as well. Like, there's some things where horses don't seem like they're being taken care of well or whatever. Can you go into a little bit about that? Like, how common is it for it to be, a negative space, if you will? And can you just tell us a little bit more about that? Because I think that this will lead into your book. I read the summary of your book, and I'm really curious to hear more about, that. But yeah.
Yeah, I can definitely talk about that. So in racing, there's quite a bit of money that's involved in racing. There's money in breeding. Some stallions will go just a stud fee of over $100,000. You'll see a couple of them, but there's a lot of money in the breeding side of the business. There's a lot of money in the auctions. Let's just say there's yearling auctions. There's mixed auctions, which would be weanlings, yearlings, and broodmares, and horses of racing age. And then there's 2-year-olds in training auctions. And if you look at some of the sites, Fasig-Tipton or Keeneland, you'll see that the amount of money that might be paid for a particular horse, it could be quite a bit depending on the horse itself, pedigree, conformation, and what the potential expectations of the buyer are. But you'll definitely see a few horses each year sell at Keeneland that will be over $1 million. You'll see horses for several $100,000 in these 2-year-old sales, and again, some of them will go over $1 million. And so there's a lot of money just on that side of the ledger. On the other side of the ledger, and some of the races will be quite valuable too. The Kentucky Derby, or any of the Triple Crown races. There's international races, but even some of the other races could bring in purses of $100,000 for the winner, or that's split up amongst the top 3 or 4 finishers. Typically, the first place will get about 60%, 55 or 60% of that purse money. So if it's a $100,000 purse, you can win a race and collect $60,000. So there's a lot of money on that side of it too. And then there's the gambling element of it. There's been gambling with horse racing, going back as far as there's been horse racing practically. And so when you have folks that are wagering on the races, and there's a lot of money that goes into those pools as well, there could be a little incentive, let's say, to manipulate the results. And I think that's something that probably happened to a much greater extent back in the days when things weren't nearly as regulated, or people weren't quite as empathetic in terms of the horses themselves. these are back in the days when, to get a horse ready, you would break the horse, and we still call it breaking, but we don't do it the way we used to. The term comes from you would break the will of the horse and get them to follow you, and that's where the term comes from. And today we do what's called gentling, which is getting the horse to cooperate with you, and that's the practice that most, if not all, of the racing trainers are following today. But again, back in those days, if you think about some of the older, we'll call it black and white videos of horse races, that's probably what was going on to some extent back then. Things have definitely improved. There's a lot more testing. There's a lot more regulations. It's a far more challenging space, I would say, to manipulate or cheat or try to do something that's gonna change the odds in your favor. I would also say that the level of awareness is way better now too, and the reason why most people are involved with horses on the racetrack is because they really want to be with the horses, and they want to. That's a lifestyle for them, and they're not. I'd say you hear about some of the big trainers and some of the big money that they're making, but the grooms, the exercise riders, most of the jockeys, most of the trainers, assistant trainers, they're not getting super wealthy, from doing this. They're doing it because this is really what this is what they want to do. This is where they, like I mentioned, it's a lifestyle for them. So are there some bad actors? Is the possibility there for, a horse to, fall through the cracks or get abused or get used in a certain way? Certainly there's the bad actor. And I think that's where, the mainstream media might get hold of some of those stories, and they'll exacerbate them to the point where, it looks like that's the main narrative in terms of what's going on. And quite frankly, racing hasn't done a great job in terms of promoting some of the good things that are going on within, on the backstretch. They seem to get a little bit, in my opinion, they can get caught up in their own bubble sometimes a bit. And I think they almost get a little overly defensive about things when these stories do come out. And I think it's it's kind of like what we were talking about earlier. When you get on the horse at first, you want to tighten because you want to protect yourself. And I think racing kind of metaphorically does that to some extent with some of the stuff that goes on. Instead of just saying, okay, let's just relax. Let's just acknowledge some of the things that may have happened, and let's talk about how we're doing, how we're addressing that and making things better for the horse. Because it has gotten, even in the 20 plus years that I've been doing it with the racehorses, it's gotten a lot better in terms of just public awareness, testing, ferreting out the ones that aren't playing by the rules. There's been more self-policing. So I think we're definitely going in the right direction, but some things you just can't control. You can't control the weather. You can control the surface, but sometimes, bad things might happen, on the racetrack, in which case you've got to really address that. If a horse breaks down because of a problem on the surface, because the weather had some issues, or caused some issues, I should say. What we're seeing now is the racetracks are being much more proactive about checking those conditions. They're being much more conservative in canceling races if there are weather issues. So even that's improving, and we're seeing that through the statistics as well in terms of just the health of the racehorses themselves. But I would say just kind of maybe close on this particular topic is anybody that has sort of this thought process where they think that bad things might be happening to these horses on the backstretch. I would just recommend just go to the backstretch. Just show up back there, get a visitor pass and take a walk around, and you'll see that what you think is going on probably isn't going on at all. It's people that are really just taking care of the horses, going about their business. They're getting washed, they're getting groomed, they're getting exercised, they're getting checked, they're getting vetted. They're definitely not being, mishandled or anything like that.
Well, that's really cool, and it's really reassuring to hear, from someone that's like directly involved in the industry, because hearing from people that aren't directly involved in the industry, I don't know how much experience these people have with them. I've had the wonderful opportunity of meeting 2 retired racehorses, and they're actually on the property that I'm on currently, and they, I think only one of them technically raced, but the other one was trained to race at a young age, and he wasn't able to actually race due to some front leg issues that he's still dealing with today, and it's been years. But yeah, it's that, and watching these 2 run, it's like it's I don't know, it's like watching I can't even explain it. Like you can tell that's where they that's what they were made to do. It's what they were created to do. And it's unlike watching any other horse. I mean, it kind of reminds me, so I have a Mustang. I'm really passionate about the Mustangs. It reminds me of watching like a whole herd of Mustangs run together. Like that's what they were made to do. And watching these retired racehorses, these thoroughbreds just, run their hearts out is such a beautiful sight. And I can only imagine, the connection that Atlas, one of them, had with his rider, just that being able to just go and express himself in that way. And so it's with that, it's beautiful to hear and know that they are generally treated very well, and it sounds like they really enjoy, the horses really enjoyed doing what they're doing. Given, I think that in every industry there's going to be things that happen that aren't necessarily supposed to happen, whatever, but it's cool to know that generally everything is going well.
I totally agree. When you've got a lot of money, when you've got gambling involved, there's a lot of stakes that are at play. It becomes a bit of an invitation to see what you can get away with sometimes, and it's not limited to racing in the thoroughbred business. You can really apply that to anything. Big business, government, other sports. It's certainly not unique or specific to horse racing.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's definitely like there's a fine line between there are good people, there are people that really truly desire to help and be of service to the animals, connect with them, whatever, and there are people that unfortunately just have negative intentions in anything. So the difference with racing is you are dealing with an animal that doesn't have a voice for themselves, and you really do have to make sure you're operating in terms of what's in the best what's in the best welfare of the horse. And you mentioned your horse that never raced. It's going to happen. You're going to find a horse that you have to just back off on, or maybe it's a horse that is racing and comes down with a slight issue, and your ability to detect that issue enables that horse to avoid a major injury, have the time to heal, and then get back to work and do what they want to do. And I've actually seen that a couple times with my trainers who they've through their experience they see something's not quite right with the horse, and they might do an extra check on it and say, oh wow, there is something not quite right here, and we'll just back off right then and there and just let the horse give it the time it needs. And because you have to be the advocate for the horse, they can't advocate for themselves. And that's probably the one difference between maybe racing and some other sports, where if there's things that are going on in other sports, people are doing it I'd say willingly, as opposed to the horse who's an unwilling participant perhaps in
and some of that stuff that might happen. But it really is the minority, and I think it's becoming even less and less of a problem. But
That's
racing
really
can do
cool.
a little bit more in terms of their own, marketing in that sense.
Yeah, fair enough. I definitely think, I mean, I can, I hear where you're going with that, but I think a lot of people especially kind of gravitate toward like negativity as being, I don't know, it's like it's drama. They crave the drama, and
Of course, yeah.
I wonder how much of that is just, them like other industries, like showcasing the negativity just to get more eyes on it and get more people discussing it and whatever. But
it works because they get more people.
It definitely does. It
Yes.
definitely does. But I wanna talk a bit about your book, and I guess to start, what was your inspiration? Like, what led you to begin writing it in the first place, and where did the storyline? How did you decide on a story to tell, on the storyline to tell?
The start of the book, or what kind of got me going on it, was to tell the story of a racehorse, and I had been recently been looking into the retired racehorses and what may happen to the racehorse after their career is over. I had a racehorse who was injured and would no longer be able to race. And in the beginning, when you starting out as a racehorse owner, all you're thinking about is getting them to the races and the excitement and hopefully winning and going to the winner's circle and all the glory that goes with that. And you don't necessarily think about at some point this horse isn't going to be able to run anymore, and what do you do with the horse? And, they can't race anymore. And so with my first horse that hit that point, she became a broodmare for me, but it really got me thinking in terms of, okay, what does happen and where do they go? And there's a story of the horse called Ferdinand. Ferdinand was a Kentucky Derby winner. I think it was back in the 80s. Maybe it was the 90s. But he won the Kentucky Derby, and he looked to be a very valuable racehorse. And he ended up going to Japan for to be a stallion or stud in Japan. And apparently his first few crops of prodigy were not very good on the racetrack. And so they sold him from one farm to another farm. And, they weren't, his babies weren't quite, competitive again on the racetrack. And he went to another farm, and he went to another farm. And eventually, he passed through many hands, and he ended up in a slaughterhouse in Japan. And when I heard about this, I thought to myself, how is it possible that a horse you might have spent, maybe a couple $100,000 for, maybe even more, a horse that wins the Kentucky Derby, how does this horse end up in the food chain? It just really just took me to, it just blew me away that actually could happen. And so I thought, let me see if I can write a story in which I can, describe a scenario in which that could happen. And so that was the beginning of the story for me, was let me show a racehorse sort of from birth through the auction ring, through their racing career, and see what happens, after the racing career is over. What kind of situation can this horse end up in? And so that was the starting point. As far as the story itself goes, that alone was not interesting enough in terms of it being, something that was super exciting to read. And so what I wanted to do is wrap a really interesting and exciting story, around that sort of timeline for the horse itself. And so that's what I ended up doing, was I created a bunch of characters, some of them not so good, some of them, better than others. Some of them for sure, likable characters. I think the protagonist and I think some of the main characters are quite likable. But that really became, where the story really started to become much more of a story. It had to be, from my perspective, it had to be something that readers would want to read, that it's not just a documentary or it's it's just this narration of the life cycle of a horse, but, how does the horse end up like that? And, what do you do with a horse that you think can possibly go to the Kentucky Derby, and what happens if they don't quite make that? And so there's a lot happening. And, of course, as we talked about earlier, the racetrack could be an area where things may not be completely on the up and up, in, of course, a hypothetical and fictional way. And so I brought in a couple of nefarious characters. We've got some mobsters, we've got some folks that are trying to fix races, we've got people that are a little bit more righteous, people that are compromised, and it all sorts to come together in the story. So my goal with the book, once I had sort of the framework for it and the story, was to have readers, as they go through it, want to just get to the next chapter. Be like, okay, I want to know what happens next, because you just hook them in terms of the story itself. And so that's hopefully what readers will experience as they go through the book. And the feedback I've gotten has supported that so far. So I'm pretty happy with the feedback I've gotten on it so far.
That's really cool. I mean, like I mentioned earlier, I've read the summary, and it's definitely on my to-do, my list of books to read list. Like it seems like a wonderful read, and reading the summary initially, it was just like, man, there's a lot of thought and there's a lot of care that's gone into this alone. But there's one lingering question. How did you decide on the title? Like, what is the meaning behind the title? Because I'm very curious about that.
Yeah, it's kind of funny you ask. I get that question quite a bit.
Okay.
In terms of where did you come up with that title? I actually had a racehorse whose name was Heliacal Rising at one point. And the reason why I picked that, the reason why I picked that name for the horse is I thought it was just kind of a cool name. But the reason why I picked the name for the book was it was a title that I think would grab people's attention. They would do exactly what you're doing and be like, what, where does that come from? And you look up Heliacal and you kind of see what it means. And then it's the name of the horse in the book is Heliacal Star. So he's the racehorse, and he's sort of the main character, even though he's not the protagonist, but he's the central theme that connects everybody in the story together. And it does go to a couple of dark places. I will forewarn anyone that's reading it. There are definitely going to be some areas that you're going to be like, okay, we're going to go there. But it also, I think, provides a really good insight into what you might experience on the backstretch, or what you might experience in terms of being at the racetrack, and kind of getting into the mindset of the person that's involved in whether they're wagering on the horse or training the horse, or just involved in some various ways with the track and the racing. And so you'll definitely get drawn into that world, and hopefully as a reader you'll find yourself on the backstretch and kind of envisioning what's going on back there too.
That sounds so cool. It sounds like it'll give a lot more kind of information like that will apply to the real world and racing as well. I mean, even though it's a fiction story.
Some of it will. Yeah, some of it will.
Cool.
Some of it is definitely, made up, and that's necessary to make for a good story. But a lot of it, there's a lot of it grounded in reality. A lot of it's based on my own personal experiences, and so you'll see that as you go through the pages of the book too.
Did the horses in your life that you've met or that you currently have, did they help in the way of like writing the book? And I know this could like get into some spiritual stuff possibly, but like did they have a part in like helping you create, say, the main character of the book, or aside from them, being like racehorses?
Yeah, I think so. I think they did. The experience that I've had with horses and my ability, or not my ability, but my relationship and how that's changed over the years is somewhat reflected, I think, in the book itself. The way the main character gets affiliated or decides to has an affinity for this particular horse is through a nonverbal connection that they make, when the horse is in the paddock, and he goes ahead and makes a hunch bet because the horse kind of signaled to him, "Hey, I'm going to win this race," and no one else detected it. Well, and so he goes ahead and makes this hunch bet, and then he's kind of wondering himself, well, what was I thinking? Where did that come from? And I don't want to give too much away, but the from there he becomes quite attached to the horse, after that, and so that attachment actually that he has to the horse starts to get him thinking in terms of what happens with these horses too, and he starts to learn a whole lot about things that are going on beyond the racetrack, because his background has been he was a former bookie, so he knows all about the gambling side of things, and he's been involved with some of the mobsters in his past, and so he knows about that side of the business. And so the horse kind of opens up a slightly, maybe not slightly, but he opens up a whole new world, I think, in terms of, this, the horse and the relationship that you can form with that horse. And throughout his life, he was just someone that would be watching the races or gambling on the races. And so, we see his character kind of evolve, I think, throughout the story as well.
It's really beautiful to know that the character that you've created in the book or for the book, it's like he's getting to experience the, call it, magical connection of the horse as well. I think horses definitely have that way of, just nudging us in the right direction, or I don't know, some people have expressed, seeing a specific horse in a dream and then being like, where, like, now I'm drawn to this horse or something, that I know that sounds like that's a huge example, but other people, they just, they see a horse and they just feel like the horse is like, hey, they're like, they've got something to say. I've definitely experienced that with my guys, and it's a pretty powerful experience. And reading too, like that's one of I love reading, so I'm really excited to dive into your book and in a way connect with this character that you're explaining, and the horse and what the horse has to go through, and it definitely sounds like a very insightful and very well crafted book. It sounds like a
you'll find
read.
several of the characters I think you'll find is pretty relatable, and
really cool.
And you'll get to know them as you go through the book, and some of them you'll be rooting for, and some of them you'll be rooting against, and it's but they're all some of them are a bit complex too, so you have to kind of make your own opinions, but it does make for a good story.
Well, I'm looking forward to reading it. Thank you so much for sharing. I am curious about you. Did I read that you have 2 broodmares?
I do. Yeah.
I'm curious about them.
Yeah. Sure. Well, I've got one that's on the East Coast, and I've got one that's on the West Coast. I'm actually located on the West Coast. And they were both former racehorses. The one on the East Coast, she only raced about 2 or 3 times, and she's got a really nice pedigree in terms of racing family. And she's also very well conformed in terms of just how she's built. But she had a couple of minor issues, and kind of as we were talking about earlier, we're not going to push the horses to do something that they're just not capable of doing. And so retired her after her 3-year-old season, and I think she only had about 2 or 3 races. And so she's in foal right now, and her baby is due probably in the March, April timeframe of next year.
Oh, how cool.
And that'll be her first baby. And then I've got another broodmare that I co-own with my trainer, and she's on the West Coast. And she's had a couple of babies so far. She's had 3 that have made it to the races, and she's got a 4th that's a yearling right now. And of the 3 that made it to the races, the first 2 have both won. I think they both won at least 4 races each so far in their careers. So they've been pretty good. And the third one, he's run second and third in his career. And he's only raced about 4 or 5 times. So we're hoping that he's a 3-year-old. So we're hoping that he'll start winning probably pretty soon.
That's really
so
cool.
So she's been pretty good, and she's also she's not in foal right now. She does have a weanling and a yearling, and she was barren last year because she foaled pretty late in the season. So she's going to be actually she should be on her way to Kentucky right now for breeding season, and looking at a couple of different stallion options for her at this point.
Wow, man, that's really cool. That sounds like such a fun thing to keep. I guess keep tabs on, and I mean watching the babies grow and being able to watch them race and kind of experience how that goes.
It's definitely it's very exciting to. It's exciting to have a racehorse and just watch them on the racetrack. And there are different ways in which you can acquire a racehorse. But I think breeding the horse and, watching it from birth through, through their adolescence, so to speak, and, watching them grow up and then seeing them become a racehorse and then perform on the racetrack. I mean, there's just something that's a little extra special about being part of that.
That's really cool. How soon does a young racehorse start training?
So when they're yearlings is when they'll first get gentled, so to speak. They'll get a saddle. They'll be lunged. Probably not really going to get. They might get somebody just to sit up on them and maybe walk around a little bit. As they transition from yearling to 2-year-old, that's when they'll actually start to get a little bit more. So they'll be familiar with saddling and just have that sort of initial experience as a yearling. But then as they go into their 2-year-old year, they'll get a little bit more activity. We'll do some galloping or jogging on them as yearlings into 2-year-olds. We won't run them really hard until they're we'll inspect their knees to just make sure everything is closed up, and that they're actually ready to take on a little bit more of that pressure from racing. And so after that's done, they could potentially get to the racetrack, as a 2-year-old. We're going to be a little bit conservative when it comes to the 2-year-olds. They'll buck shins quite often if just again from the stresses that they're and the concussion on their legs. But if they're sound and they're doing well and they continue to grow and they continue to move correctly, then they could actually start racing as a 2-year-old. Some places will actually have a few 2-year-old races as early as May, June.
Wow.
Yeah, and every racehorse actually has a birth date of January the 1st, no matter what day of the year they're born. And so the horses that are typically born more in the January, February, March timeframe, they're more likely to race as 2-year-olds versus those that might be born in April, May.
Okay.
Yeah, so we're just gonna keep an eye on them, and we'll it's usually, there's some discussion about, we shouldn't race horses until they're 4 or 5 because they don't really, fully grow until then. But having them with a couple of races as a 2-year-old actually builds their foundation, and it gives them, a little bit. I think it gives them a little bit more durability actually as they get older. But you don't want to overdo it. If again, they are still pretty young and they're still developing, so you want to be careful about that. But
yeah, that's another thing, like controversial. I mean, like I've said, I've heard a number of differing things about a good amount of like horse industries, not just racing, but people are like, oh, they shouldn't race them that young, but it's one of those things. It sounds like, again, you're watching the horse, you're listening to the horse, and you're doing what's
exactly
best
right
for the horse, which
you have to listen to the horse. Yeah.
Yes.
And most, I'd say more than half of the 2-year-olds, they don't start until they were 3. So it's a mixed bag, and the number of 2-year-olds that do start, you might get 1 or 2 or 3 races in them as a 2-year-old, and you're going to space them out quite a bit. As they get older, they're 5, 6, 7 years old. You could probably run them every couple weeks, but yeah, about every 3 or 4 weeks you can enter in a race. But as a 2-year-old, you might space it out, 6 or 8 weeks between races too.
Well, I mean, to close up, I have one final question for you. What's your favorite way to reinforce your horses?
My favorite way to reinforce my horses is to give them lots of carrots. And
I love it.
I've seen horses that after you give them a couple carrots, they're kind of like, okay, I'm done. You can go away now. But my horse, he has a limitless appetite when it comes to carrots. In fact, I'll tell you a funny story about him actually. So he gets a bit impish when he gets shooed, and so it's not mean or anything, but he would just basically be like, no, I don't think I want to be here. And so I would stand in front of him, and he would pretty much like walk over me, like, no, you're moving. I'm not going to do this. And so, he was kind of like a moving target almost in terms of, like, can we get him to stand still for just a little while so that the farrier can do his work. So I thought to myself, and the farrier's like, maybe you want to give him a little bit of a tranquilizer that's not super uncommon to do with, especially hot bloods, that might not want to be shooed. And I'm like, or put a lip chain on him. And I'm like, I'm not putting a lip chain on him. And I really don't want to tranquilize him, I don't think. So I had this brilliant idea. I'm like, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to feed him carrots when he's getting shooed. And let's see if that works. And so I brought a couple bags of these baby carrots, and I just started feeding him when the farrier was doing his job. And remarkably, he just stood there and ate the carrots. So I would be hand feeding him the carrots, and he'd be kind of bobbing his head a little bit and such. But he stood still, and the farrier was able to do all of his work. And so that's become the routine now. That's to the point where he sees the farrier now, and he's like, oh, I'm ready. He'll walk right up there now, and he'll be like, let's go. Where are the carrots? And he'll start sniffing my pockets, and just so that's how I reinforce my horses by bribing him with carrots.
That's so fun. I definitely can relate. I have a Bashkir Curly, actually. He's like the total opposite from a thoroughbred, okay? He is like super chill. Cody's opinionated, but he's just really chill about his life. He doesn't like his feet picked up. We're still working on getting comfortable with his feet getting picked up. And he has his moments where he's like, fine, but then he has his moments where he's like, no, like just no. And so we definitely take advantage of our snacks and working on like, okay, you pick up your foot, you get it picked, you get a snack, and he's working on it. His ears will go up, and he's like, all right, this is nice. But it's pretty funny to watch as they go from like, no, this isn't something that I like or appreciate or whatever, to like, oh, I like this. I'm getting something good out of this. Nice.
Exactly.
You can continue. It's pretty
exactly.
nice.
Yeah. So that's also why I didn't want to do the tranquilize them or the lip chain, because I didn't want it to be a negative experience for him. I did want it to be a positive experience, and it's worked. And now he's very happy with the farrier.
Oh, that's so sweet. He seems like such a sweet horse. I'm so happy that he's in your life and that you get to share and connect with him. That's so cool.
Yeah, he's been great for me. So
that's really awesome.
And hopefully and me for him too. So.
Oh yeah, it definitely sounds like it. He sounds like a happy horse, and it's been really wonderful to hear a bit about your story, and definitely to hear about your book. I'm gonna check that out for sure. Yeah, thank
Excellent.
you so much for being here and.
Thank you for having me. And if anybody else is interested, they can just Amazon.com is where you can purchase it. It's Heliacal Star is the name of the book, and you can look up me, Victor Bahna, or you can look up Heliacal Star. And I also have a website which is www.victorbahna.com. So
awesome, and we will go ahead and put those in our show notes for our listeners. Yeah, thank you so much for joining me today.